The night was supposed to end like many others, with speeches, strategies, and power plays behind closed doors. But what unfolded instead would leave world leaders scrambling, analysts stunned, and the global stage forever altered. When Iran finally responded, it didn't whisper. It roared. For decades, Western powers assumed Iran would stay within a predictable pattern: calculated anger, sharp rhetoric, maybe a regional reaction, but never anything too bold. That assumption shattered when Iran launched its unexpected and sweeping retaliation. It wasn't just a military move, it was a statement, and not just to one nation, but to the entire world. The retaliation came swiftly, hitting harder than anyone in the West had anticipated. Air bases, intelligence sites, and strategic military zones lit up with explosions. Panic spread not only through the targeted regions, but through the capitals of powerful countries who thought they had a grip on Iran's capabilities. For years, global powers had underestimated Iran's patience and its precision. What they failed to see was that silence was never weakness, it was restraint. In command rooms around the globe, generals and diplomats watched live feeds and scrambled to revise decades-old assumptions. Phones rang nonstop, emergency sessions were called, and within hours, the narrative had flipped. The world was no longer asking if Iran would respond. Now the question was, how far is Iran willing to go? The retaliation was surgical, but the message was loud. Iran has red lines, and they will not be crossed without consequence. This was not a rogue move by an isolated nation. This was the calculated response of a country that had been pushed to its limits. It reminded the world that despite years of sanctions, political isolation, and constant threats, Iran had not only endured, it had grown stronger, more prepared, and more determined. This retaliation was not just about vengeance. It was about dignity, deterrence, and demonstrating strength under pressure. The shock wasn't just in the missiles or the drones, it was in the global reaction, the sudden shift in language from aggression to caution, from power to panic. Leaders who once mocked Iran's warnings now whispered in strategy rooms, trying to contain a new reality they never expected. Media channels rushed to cover the story while trying to downplay the implications. But the images, the destruction, and the tone of military experts told the truth. This was a game-changing moment. People across the world, especially in the Middle East, watched closely, some with worry, others with pride. For them, it was a long-awaited moment of defiance, a moment where one nation stood tall against intimidation, where the silence of injustice was broken by the sound of resistance. Whether they agreed politically or not, they could not deny the bravery it took to send such a bold message under such intense global pressure. And in this one night, a night of fire and fear, of chaos and clarity, the world saw something it had long ignored. Iran is not just surviving. Iran is ready. And now, every decision made by world powers will be made with that reality in mind, because the retaliation was not just an act of war, it was a reminder that even when the world turns a blind eye, even when silence seems like surrender, there comes a moment when the storm answers back. And that moment came when no one was ready. Iran's retaliation was not just a military event, it was a historic turning point that exposed the fragility of global assumptions. For years, the narrative in Western political circles suggested that Iran was a nation limited in reach, contained by sanctions, and hesitant to act beyond defensive lines. But on the night it struck back with full force, that illusion dissolved instantly. The world watched as Iran delivered a precise and massive counterattack, one that was not only surprising in its scale, but shocking in its strategic execution. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a calculated move. Iran targeted military installations with accuracy, avoided civilian zones deliberately, and showed that its intelligence network and missile capabilities had advanced far beyond what most international analysts had imagined. The psychological effect of the retaliation rippled just as deeply as the physical damage. The mere fact that Iran responded so decisively and publicly turned the usual tables of intimidation. This time, it wasn't Iran reacting to fear. It was world powers reacting to Iran's fearlessness. Decision-makers in Washington, London, and Tel Aviv were suddenly silent, scrambling to reassess not just their next steps, but their understanding of Iran altogether. The balance of power shifted, not through nuclear threats or economic deals, but through a bold declaration of resolve. What made this retaliation even more extraordinary was its symbolism. Iran didn't act out of desperation. It acted out of dignity and strategic patience. For years, it had warned that aggression would not go unanswered. And when the time came, it followed through, not with chaos, but with precision. This retaliation proved that Iran is not just reactive, it is proactive when its sovereignty and pride are on the line. The message was loud and unmistakable. Iran will not be bullied. It will respond, and it will respond with strength and clarity. To many nations and observers in the global South and Muslim world, this moment became a symbol of resistance against imperial arrogance. Iran, long demonized and misunderstood, showed that it could stand its ground and make the world take notice. For its supporters, it wasn't just a victory on the battlefield, it was a reclaiming of honor in the global arena. And from that night forward, no one could look at Iran the same way again. The silence of the world following Iran's massive retaliation was perhaps more deafening than the strikes themselves. Normally, after such a major military event, we see rapid-fire statements from world leaders, urgent emergency sessions at the United Nations, and dramatic headlines across major news networks. But this time, the global response was oddly quiet, calculated, and hesitant. Why? Because what happened that night didn't fit the script the West had written. Iran was supposed to be the threat that only talked, not the power that could hit back with such accuracy and confidence. For years, mainstream media and political institutions had painted a narrative where Iran was weak, isolated, and incapable of confronting the West. But Iran's strike shattered that illusion in real time, and the silence proved it. Behind closed doors, however, there was panic. Intelligence agencies, military analysts, and political think tanks were scrambling to reevaluate everything they thought they knew. How did Iran manage to bypass so many surveillance layers? How did they execute such a clean and calculated response without triggering a broader war? The truth was uncomfortable. Iran had been preparing quietly, patiently, and intelligently. This wasn't the action of a rogue state. It was the mark of a nation that knew its strength and had been underestimated for far too long. And while politicians stayed silent, people around the world started to ask real questions. Why is it that when one country retaliates after being provoked, it's labeled aggressive, but when another invades, it's called defense? Why is justice so unevenly defined? Iran's measured response didn't just hit military targets, it hit global conscience. The double standards were exposed. The silence of the so-called defenders of democracy became louder than any statement they could have made. In the Muslim world especially, this moment resonated deeply. Many saw in Iran's action a reflection of dignity, resistance, and courage. It wasn't about sex or politics. It was about one nation standing up against years of pressure and refusing to bow. And that act, regardless of what came next, earned respect. Iran reminded the world that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's the calm before a powerful statement. And when that statement is made with clarity, discipline, and strength, it demands a silence that speaks volumes. What truly set Iran's retaliation apart was not just its scale or precision, it was the message it carried. Iran didn't act out of desperation or rage. It acted with a clarity of purpose that was both strategic and deeply symbolic. Each missile launch wasn't just a piece of military hardware, it was a declaration. A declaration that Iran would no longer play by the rules set by powers who had long violated their own. For decades, the Middle East has been treated like a chessboard, where global players move pawns to serve their interests. But on that night, Iran flipped the board. It reminded the world that no nation, no matter how sanctioned, demonized, or isolated, should be underestimated, especially when it is defending its dignity. The strike was surgical, carefully avoiding civilian casualties while hitting military infrastructure. This was not the move of a chaotic or rogue state, but of one that understands the optics of war and the power of restraint. It was as if Iran was saying, "We don't seek chaos, but if you provoke us, we are more than capable of defending ourselves." This balance between force and discipline is exactly what left the world shaken. Because in the past, the West had always relied on Iran reacting emotionally, giving them justification for more sanctions or interventions. But this time, Iran turned the script upside down. They struck back, but on their own terms. That's why the retaliation echoed far beyond the region. Nations watching closely, from Asia to Latin America, began reevaluating their assumptions about global power. The traditional narrative of the West as the untouchable superpower began to crack. If Iran, a nation supposedly cornered by years of economic and diplomatic pressure, could respond so effectively, what did that say about the stability of Western dominance? Iran's response wasn't just military. It was psychological. It challenged the myth of invincibility. It reminded smaller nations that even in a world dominated by superpowers, dignity can still be defended. And perhaps most importantly, it revealed that power is no longer just about the size of one's arsenal, but the strength of one's resolve. That night, Iran didn't just hit targets, it shook the foundation of decades of global power and balance. In the aftermath of Iran's powerful response, what became undeniable was the shift in perception across the Muslim world and beyond. For decades, many Muslim-majority countries had looked to the West for approval, military protection, or economic partnerships, often at the cost of their sovereignty or dignity. But Iran's defiance and the clarity of its action reignited a sense of self-respect and unity among people who had long felt their voices were silenced. It wasn't just about politics, it was about honor. Iran's message was clear. Dignity is non-negotiable, and if pushed, a nation has every right to defend its principles. That resonated deeply in regions where people have seen their lands occupied, their leaders removed, and their resources exploited under the guise of democracy or freedom. Iran's strike created a new narrative, one where resistance wasn't automatically painted as extremism. It was strategic, it was calculated, and it was moral. In many ways, Iran did what others had only spoken of. It showed that being under pressure doesn't mean you're powerless, that being isolated diplomatically doesn't mean you lack influence. The Muslim world, watching carefully, saw a country that refused to kneel despite years of sanctions, threats, and smear campaigns. And while governments stayed cautious, the streets told another story of admiration, of awakening, of inspiration. It also forced a reevaluation of what it means to be powerful in today's world. Is power in how many allies you have, or is it in how steadfast you remain when standing alone? Iran proved the latter. This event wasn't about sectarian lines or political alliances. It transcended that. It became a moment of identity where many Muslims, regardless of background, saw strength in a shared cause: the defense of dignity and justice. Western policymakers may have been caught off guard, but what followed was more dangerous than retaliation. It was inspiration. Iran's act encouraged a new mindset, that it is possible to resist without being reckless, to fight back without losing moral ground. In a time when oppression often wears a diplomatic smile, Iran's boldness was like a mirror held up to the global order. And many didn't like what they saw, but millions silently applauded. Because for once, someone said enough and meant it. The media's reaction to Iran's powerful retaliation revealed more than the event itself. It exposed a double standard long embedded in global narratives. When Western powers carry out military operations, it is often framed as defense, deterrence, or a mission to maintain global peace. But when a non-Western nation like Iran takes similar action, it is immediately labeled as aggression or provocation. This imbalance in storytelling is not accidental. It is part of a carefully constructed perception campaign that controls who gets to be the hero and who must play the villain. Iran's response shattered this framework. It demanded that the world reconsider who has the right to act and why. It brought to the surface an uncomfortable truth: that the global stage is not neutral, and that power often decides whose story gets told and how. The silence of major global institutions following Iran's response was even more telling. When other nations respond to provocation, we hear calls for diplomacy and understanding. But Iran's move was met with condemnation, or worse, indifference. The double standard was glaring. Yet, instead of being discouraged, Iran's people and many across the Muslim world saw this as proof of what they had long believed, that justice and fairness are often filtered through geopolitical interest. Iran's action was not reckless, it was restrained and deliberate, but still it was seen as unacceptable because it disrupted the narrative that only the West can act decisively and still be called peaceful. This hypocrisy did not go unnoticed by ordinary people across the globe. Social media became a battleground for truth, where users shared alternative perspectives, historical context, and the broader implications of what had happened. Many realized that what they had been told for years was not the full picture. Iran's defiance sparked not just fear among its adversaries, but a flood of questions among the people, about media bias, about truth, and about who really controls the narrative. In that moment, Iran wasn't just retaliating militarily, it was reclaiming its voice. And in doing so, it encouraged others to question, to think, and to speak. That may have been the greatest impact of all, because when the oppressed find their voice, the powerful begin to tremble, not from weapons, but from truth. Perhaps the most profound effect of Iran's bold stance wasn't on battlefields or diplomatic channels, but in the hearts of millions who had been waiting for someone, anyone, to stand up. In a world that often forces weaker nations into silence and submission, Iran's refusal to bow sparked something deeply emotional in people who had long lost hope in leadership, justice, or unity. From the streets of Gaza to the hills of Kashmir, from the refugee camps of Syria to the silent prayers in mosques across Africa and Asia, the news didn't just report an attack, it carried a message. We are not afraid. That message ignited a powerful emotional reaction, especially among the youth, who have grown up feeling voiceless in the face of occupation, sanctions, and systematic injustice. Iran's move gave voice to the voiceless. For decades, Muslims have watched their lands invaded, their homes destroyed, and their dignity trampled, all while the world remained silent or justified the actions under political labels. But now, a Muslim nation had responded in a way that was firm yet not chaotic, strategic yet deeply symbolic. It wasn't about war, it was about honor. It wasn't about seeking destruction, it was about saying, we exist and we will not be erased. That psychological shift, especially among the younger generation, is far more powerful than any military operation. It reignites identity, restores confidence, and plants the seed of resistance in hearts once numb with fear. And for many Muslims around the world, Iran's act was seen through a religious lens as well. Not in the sense of sectarianism, but as a call back to the principles of standing for truth, defending the oppressed, and speaking against tyranny, values deeply rooted in Islamic teachings. It reminded many of the Prophet's, peace be upon him, legacy: to speak the truth even when it's dangerous, to protect the weak even when it's costly, and to never let fear dictate your faith. That night, as headlines flashed and statements poured in, something changed. Iran may have fired weapons, but what landed in the hearts of many was not fear, it was courage. And courage spreads. Because when one nation rises with dignity, it becomes a mirror for others to do the same. And the world, silently watching, began to feel the ripple. Iran's recent response shook the global stage, not just because of its power, but because of its timing, precision, and message. The world expected anger, maybe chaos, but what came was far more calculated, more disciplined, and more terrifying to the powers that once believed they were untouchable. Iran didn't act out of impulse. It responded with purpose, patience, and a message loud enough to send shockwaves through the corridors of Western leadership. This retaliation was not merely about revenge. It was about reclaiming dignity, about reminding the world that some nations, though isolated, are not weak, that some voices, though silenced by media, still roar with truth. Leaders around the world didn't panic because of the missiles. They panicked because the mask of control slipped. For the first time in years, they saw a nation that didn't just speak about red lines, it defended them. Today we stand witnessing a turning point in modern history. The question now isn't what Iran did, but what it exposed. The myth of invincibility, the illusion of silent victims, and the awakening of a region that's tired of bowing. Thank you for watching this story unfold with us. If you felt the weight of these events, if you saw the truth behind the silence, and if this opened your eyes even a little, then share this message, speak it forward. Because sometimes the world doesn't need more opinions, it needs courage to echo the truth. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, let's keep telling the stories the world tries to bury.